Okay, well, good afternoon. Good afternoon, everyone. Always tough coming after afternoon tea after a long day, but rest assured this panel will energise the room, and we've got a wonderful panel after this one, chaired by my colleague, Dr Nicole Biskey, with people who have really important experience of interacting with the social security system. So I think that'll be an incredibly powerful way to end the day. Like other speakers have, can I start just by acknowledging that we're on the beautiful lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. Pay my respects to elders past and present, and to all First Nations people in the room today or following this fabulous summit online. My name is Travers McLeod. I am about 6 foot tall. I'm wearing a maroon jacket. I'm not a Queenslander though, and I've got a white shirt on, and I'm here on stage with a wonderful panel I'll introduce you to in a moment. And I'm Executive Director of the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, or BSL. The reason why I wanted to give this quick introduction, and I hope she's in the room, she is just to say how delighted BSL is to support this summit. And I really want to commend Emma, you and the Per Capita team, all the supporters and partners for such a wonderful job over a very quick few months. Ken Henry said this morning that conversations about tax are boring, and I think the headlines that he's generated in some of the papers suggest otherwise. But what's been really wonderful sitting here today is how informative, how constructive, how collaborative and purposeful the conversation has been. And that doesn't happen without a huge amount of work. And you've been a formidable leader of Per Capita and the public policy discussion for so long. So can we all give Emma a round of applause? Now, the focus of this panel is on welfare and social assistance, but particularly the relationship of our tax and transfer system with our social security system, the social services system on which all Australians rely. And we heard a little bit about the interdependence between the social security system and our tax and transfer system in the brilliant presentation that Professor Miranda Stewart gave to us after lunch. And it's a real delight to have Elly, Kasy and Jenny here to offer their expertise and ideas, and I'll introduce them in a moment. In terms of framing the conversation, I just want to start with where Ken Henry finished his excellent keynote speech this morning. He said that we are back in the post-World War II era from the perspective of our tax and transfer system. He said we have deep problems with our tax system that are causing a tragedy of intergenerational inequity and threatening our social compact. Pretty powerful conclusions. What's interesting, or one of the things that's interesting about that from my perspective, is that going back to the post-Second World War era is also where there was a deep focus on the aspirations of our social security system. It's where there was a paper introduced to the Federal Parliament by Ben Chifley, where he quite famously said that the modern ideal of our social security system is to protect every citizen in his or her emergencies from the cradle to the grave. And since then we've seen some remarkable services, essential services, payments and otherwise grow to support Australians in their emergencies. Ken spoke also about Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum and how their work, and you'll hear about this probably tomorrow from Catherine Trebek, how their work around human capability should and has informed the aspiration of the tax system. And the reality is those ideas are meant to inform and underpin our social security system as well. So those two systems combined, the tax and transfer system and our social services system, they should combine to empower people in Australia to live the lives they aspire to, lives that they have reason to value. And the imperative of our tax and social security systems together to enrich human capability is something that has always motivated the work of BSL, and I can see Alison McLennell and others that have been involved with BSL over the generations. Our organisation has 2,500 staff and volunteers working across the life course to work with communities to build confidence and capability in the early years, financial inclusion, economic security, disability services, aged care services, and our op shops and stores, and quite a big investment into policy research and evaluation. But those ideas from Sen and Nussbaum about human capability and the aspirations of a democracy are very much those that have underpinned and continue to underpin our work. You've heard a lot, we've heard a lot about those ideas today and how well or not so well the country is going at fulfilling them. Whether it's the adequacy of social security payments, the inability to define or to measure poverty formally or officially, the use of service systems like our employment services system in particular, in the words of the House of Representatives review of that system, like using a nuclear bomb to kill a mosquito. The same laziness that Ken Henry described insofar as tax reform is concerned is what a lot of people in the room have seen about the laziness of reforming our social security system. And that's not intended as a comment on the Australians that rely and expect to rely on that system, but the laziness of the system itself, the inertia in the system that has meant that so much of the system has not been evaluated, indexed or changed for decades. Things like the liquid assets waiting period threshold, work limit rules, particularly for people with disability, working credit, the remote area allowance, the adequacy and indexation of payments, all the nature and functioning of the services Australians would regard as essential services: early childhood, employment, disability, aged care. BSL's view is that it's impossible to have a national agenda and strategy on poverty reduction or a national agenda and strategy on growing equity across the generations without comprehensive tax reform that has broad community support. And we agree there's a danger in considering one part of the smorgasbord of options without a comprehensive package that creates a sustainable revenue base for the country into the future. We know from Per Capita's work, about 2/3 of Australians thinking that more could be invested into public and community services. Work from others, including the Centre for Policy Development, I can see Warwick somewhere, about how most Australians think the main purpose of their democracy is to improve the lives of others, especially the most vulnerable. And what we know about the expectations of Australians about the services that we've all come to rely on since those words were uttered by Chifley. Not just about their aspirations to live the lives they aspire to, but the aspiration for the quality of those services and the aspirations for the way in which our social security system can invest confidence and capability in all people in Australia. So to talk about that, it's my great pleasure to introduce Elly Desmarchelier, who is a writer, speaker and famous disability rights advocate who has done a power of work for many years, but particularly around saving and safeguarding NDIS and at the Job Summit and others, which you'll hear about. Kasy Chambers is Executive Director of Anglicare Australia, and Jenny Davidson, who's the CEO of the Council of Single Mothers and Their Children here in Victoria. They're brilliant and we'll learn a lot from their experience and their expertise today. What I'll do in a moment is move and sit down and join them, but I'd like to sort of start with an opening question to each of you about how, in your experience, the tax and transfer system has interacted with welfare and services and social security, and what implications that has had for the way we think about the social security system and those services. And Elly, I might start with you.
Thank you. Look, I'm obviously going to talk about disability and the disability sphere, but I'm going to be completely honest and I'm going to be completely vulnerable and let you know that when I was emailed a version of this question as it being our opening statement question, I went, tax and transfer system. I went, I'm going to go on an AI app and I'm going to ask, what is a tax and transfer system? Because I am a campaigner. I'm not an economist. And I know what it is. There's lots of simpler ways of putting it than tax and transfer. I am a campaigner and I come at this from a campaigning point of view, but there's lots of interesting things that have happened in the tax and transfer system area of disability. So we have something called the NDIS, which is, replace something that was a rationed welfare system which was so inadequate that there were people with disability who were having one meal a day, one shower a week, leaving the house once a week. It was the most appalling stories you've ever heard. And we, as a community, the disability community, galvanized a nation around the idea of a disability insurance scheme, a rights-based model, an insurance model that meant that people with disability got what they needed to live a life of their own dreams, not based on the amount of a package that the government decided, well, that's the package you're going to get. It was quite revolutionary, really. Now, before I go on to where it kind of fell apart, it transformed lives. It has transformed my own life. I talk about the fact that when I got my first NDIS plan, I was sitting in a wheelchair that I had bought from the special buys section at Aldi because it was the only wheelchair that my family could afford. I couldn't push myself. My feet didn't touch the foot plates. It caused actual pain to sit in and meant I couldn't work. And so I was pushed around in this wheelchair that just was so inadequate. And to get my first wheelchair that was made for me was liberating. It meant I got to go to work. It meant I got to go out with friends. It meant the NDIS transformed everything about my life. It gave me full dignity. It gave me full hope. So before I go and kind of criticize it, I talk to people with disability every day who have had that same experience with the NDIS. But what happened in its implementation and 10 years of coalition overseeing it is that it was left to a free market to implement it for people with disability. People with disability were handed over to support coordinators and plan managers and, a whole new free market opened up where there was no regulation and, the worst kinds of people flooded the market looking to make money very quickly. And what happens then? People are there to be exploited, and people with disability were exploited. And what we've seen over the last 3 years is the government trying to rein that back in, but it's really hard to do once it's flooded. Now, those are two really different welfare systems. But what I want to talk about in the tax part of it is what paid for the NDIS was a tax increase. And it was a tax increase that the Australian people were really happy to pay. We talk about all the time, we can't increase taxes. No one's going to accept increasing taxes. Actually, everyone was happy to pay that levy. Everyone was happy to pay that levy to fund the NDIS. And so that's a story of if you can connect a tax increase to an actual outcome, to people's lives as a campaigner, you can get it past the Australian people. As the Australian people want to see good services, they want to see good welfare, they want to see people lifted out of poverty. And they want to see their tax dollars do that. But I think they just don't trust the idea that, well, if we just generally pay more tax, that's going to happen. They want to see it specifically targeted to things. So that's my first initial answer on tax and transfer systems.
And a brilliant answer at that, Elly. Thank you so much. And I think the whole room would agree that the NDIS is probably, apart from Medicare, the most significant economic and social reform this country has seen. And as you've said, it has changed lives, and it was funded by an increase people were happy to pay because they saw real outcomes, and the scheme that was created and hopefully is sustainable into the future. Kasy.
If there's one thing harder than following afternoon tea, it's following Elly, I think. Look, there are a few points that I wanted to make in terms of welfare and social assistance. We've had it said a number of times, and another point is actually being on one of the last panels, lots of things have been said, so I don't have to say half the things I was going to say. I spent the day crossing things out and writing new things. But I don't think we can say enough how inadequate welfare payments are. And some of the reason being for that we still have very much, and I'm going to say later, I think we have a taxation system that's set in the 1950s or set for a world and a society that was in the 1950s. We also have welfare payments, particularly working age payments, that are around that, that kind of time, in such that we have an assumption that they're temporary, and we know that most people, or many people, are no longer have a short time on job seeker. I can bore you to tears. We could be here till 10 o'clock if I just talked about the evidence that we, just as at Anglicare Australia, have built about the inadequacy. So I don't want to spend a lot of time doing that. But we know that people aren't on those payments for a short period of time. We also know that what we've done through that is we've really individualised the risk of economic innovation and economic changes. And people can't get jobs easily. There isn't that movement, if you lose one job, you can get another, so much as there used to be. Our own jobs availability snapshot shows that people who have added barriers to work, they might have a partial disability, they might be older workers, they might be people returning to work, there might be people with English as a second, third, fourth, fifth language. These shouldn't be barriers, by the way, but we know that they are, or even simply being long-term unemployed. Our research that we do annually, 2024's research showed that for every available job at that kind of entry level, there were 21 disadvantaged job seekers. And if we just think about the fact that actually any job seeker can go for those kind of roles while you're waiting for, if you're a doctor, while you're waiting for that role to come through, you can still apply for a job in retail or an entry level in security, something like that. So if we do that, there were 33 people who are unemployed for every one entry level job. So we can see that there's not that flexibility or mobility. So we have to think about the fact that those welfare payments are very, very low. Lots and lots of evidence again to show that when we increase those during COVID, or when people come off those welfare benefits due to a windfall gain or something like that, the sky doesn't fall in, they don't go on surfing holidays to Bali. They actually engage in lots of forward-focused, lots of future-focused kind of things. It might be training, it might be really spending time looking for work and getting a job, as opposed to the busy hamster wheel work that mutual obligations require that they do. So we know that, when welfare payments are better, are bigger, are more appropriate, people actually are more likely to engage in activity that then goes into the taxation system as well. I also wanted to talk about other forms of social services. So there's lots of forms of social services that agencies around here run, that many of us use throughout our lifetime, that Trav, you talked about, that system for emergencies in your life. Those are the kind of services that Anglicare Australia members run. And they are, what I wanted to say was, prevention is always so much better than cure and so much cheaper than cure. And so if we funded those better, and one of the big issues for anybody involved in this form of service, and I call it service because it is service to the rest of all of our community, is that we know that we get better outcomes. And by the way, I'm talking about financial outcomes, which doesn't come easily to me, but we know here financial outcomes also equal better outcomes for people. But we know that if we can prevent some of those things, we actually get better outcomes. And again, keep people where their aspirations would want them to be, as well as paying tax potentially. So a couple of very quick numbers. Out of home care for kids. We did Anglicare Victoria, here based in Melbourne, did some work on this, looked at the return on investment. What it found was that at that time, pre-COVID, each child cost the state $27,800. Because of the return on investment in avoided costs of having children in that care, we could actually have gone up to $51,300 without having a point where the costs outweighed the benefits. So there's a return on investment of doing early investment. Another example at the other end of the age stage is that in aged care, if you require help in the home, and it's a wonderful thing that we're all going to live longer and that we're actually able to get care in the home. So it is a success story. The most common package is a level 2 package for care in the home. It costs the Australian government $19,000. The waiting list for a level 4 package, I know I'm mixing around here, is somewhere between 15 to 18 months. That's just ridiculous. And what that means is, well, you may actually die waiting, if I'm being very frank, but what it means is you're more likely to go into residential care. Residential care costs at the starting payment, $105,000. So 3 times the amount of what that package would have cost. So we can see that prevention is always going to be better if we spent more money up front in those services. Another thing I did want to touch on is that welfare and social assistance, we are seeing what I would call poverty, or the effects of poverty climbing the income range. So, for example, our rental affordability snapshot for essential workers showed that for nurses, so people with a 4-year degree, only 3.4% of all of the private rentals that were available on our snapshot day would have been affordable. So that wage is no longer enough. And one more example, Food Bank found that 1 in 5 families on a median wage are accessing food. So it's a conversation we have to have. I think we have to have it very broadly. I think somehow we've got to find a way to make taxation great again, just to quote the elephant in the room. And it's great to be here having that conversation.
Thank you, Kasy. Well, we almost got to 4 o'clock without a quote from, or at least paraphrasing, President of United States. What you said about prevention is incredibly powerful. Thank you for those statistics as well. I mean, it aligns with what Fran said earlier about, one of the best things we can do for health in Australia is become a more equitable society. Jenny, over to you.
Thank you, Trevor. Single mothers head 1 in 7 families with dependents in Australia. So dependents are not just children, but also young people up to the age of 24 in full-time study. We know they're all still at home with their mums, right? So it is the poorest family structure in Australia. And that isn't the only reason why it's representative to talk about single mothers. They're also the nexus of a lot of gender inequality in our society. Upwards of 60% of single mothers may have experienced family violence, 60% or more. They are also, of course, on the wrong end of their wage gap, but we are also talking about the division of care. So even when a father is actively involved, single mothers have the majority of care, and there's plenty of single mothers that have full care. We, Council of Single Mothers and Their Children, undertake a national survey of single mothers. We've done 2, 4 years apart, with over 1,100 respondents each time, which means it's a big data bank of current data. And what was really interesting in the last one was these were women who responded who were working at almost identical the levels of the average Australian woman, almost identical hours. So most working part-time. And they had their children on average 12 out of 14 days in a fortnight. Now, if we think about the average working week is Monday to Friday, the majority of the jobs are available then. As soon as you have your kids, even if they're not in primary school or preschool, you still have to be around, you have to drive them around, you have to take them to appointments. The opportunity cost of that care is massive. But that's not all. It's also that the essential unpaid care that single mothers are providing to their children at all stages hasn't been touched on today. And why is that? It's because it's not part of the formal economy. You know, it's not part of GDP. It doesn't show up anywhere in tax and transfer. So, you know, despite the best works of Marilyn Waring, it's still invisible. So if an employment provider pushes you to say, put your child in childcare and get a crap job where you're going to have less time and probably not be any better off financially, but you're not doing free care for your children, you're putting them in paid childcare where it shows up in the formal economy and creates jobs. And that is what our society and the setup of our tax and transfer system is valuing. And we really don't want to become a society where the luxury of making a choice to look after your children becomes a luxury, where you have to have a second income earner or independent means in order to be able to stay home. In fact, looking after kids is one of those stages of life when we need our social security net, just like when you're sick or you're unemployed or you're older. That's why the system exists. The other reason we like to talk about single mothers is because we call them in our organisation the thin end of the wedge. If you can get your policy settings right for single mothers, then they're going to be right for lots of disadvantaged groups. So that's obviously true in social security. Another example is employers. If employers can find a way to give single mothers secure part-time work instead of this huge casualisation we see in this workforce, then those employers are also going to have workforces that workplaces that meet the needs of parents, people caring for someone with disability, and of course our growing cohort of people caring for elders. The reality is that families, single mother-headed families, among others, that rely on the social security system are in dire poverty and precarity. And this seeds into generational poverty, which then reduces participation in paying income tax for the next generation, as well as having their opportunities burnt before them. All working age payments need to be raised above the poverty level, so they could be equal to the age pension, and rent assistance needs to be at least doubled for everyone, including those on age pension, because it's predicated on home ownership, and we know that's no longer the case. And rent assistance needs to be indexed to something like capital city rents for the lower quintile, not CPI. So that's one of the solutions. But also our employment support system has been privatised. And so the whole system, first of all, mutual obligations aren't doing anyone any good. And there's no, it doesn't, even the most disadvantaged job seekers are not going to be encouraged to be self-sufficient and have confidence by these very paternalistic policing systems. It's actually counterproductive. But on top of that, these systems are set up in such a way that the providers of employment services get a kickback when someone takes a job and when they stay in it. And so we're pushing people into taking these jobs that are minimum wage, and while the family might not be any better off financially, the parent or parents, but the parent in this case is much more time poor. So then we have these families where children aren't able to be looked after, where there are costs of childcare and before and after care. And, it's not just young children. Teenagers need parents around too. We're seeing, there's so much anxiety post-COVID, and God knows we speak to parents who are dragging their children through the senior years of school and they need to be around. So when employment services undermine the long-term career trajectory, whatever your career might be at all levels of these people, then they, of course, pay less tax as well. And And the next generation is also less likely to be encouraged, enabled and inspired to go out there and be fully able to contribute to our community.
Thank you, Jenny. And thank you for that. And I can see Therese Edwards in the room, and I just want to acknowledge the advocacy of lots of people in the room, including Therese, who's CEO of the Council for Single Mother Children and their families, for all the work around the single parenting payment and the abolition of Parents Next and changes to care payment limits and those sorts of things. So well done to you and to everyone involved. So a follow-up question for all of you, but first one's for you, Elly. So even though you said you weren't an economist and then you spoke very powerfully about how our tax system can transform lives, you also talked about your experience as a campaigner. And what we've heard today from lots of people is that if tax reform is going to happen to safeguard current and future generations, it has to be a comprehensive package and would need to be supported by a broad community campaign. So if you were, not in your current job, but asked to run a national campaign on comprehensive tax reform, how would you go about it? What would you prioritise?
Firstly, bring it on. Can I just need to, for a second, we've been talking about poverty, and 57% of people in poverty are people with disability, and we represent 18% of the population. 50% of people on Job Seeker are people with disability. We have, I didn't get to, the NDIS really is an oasis in the desert. That's what Bill Shorten used to keep saying over and over and over again, but it is the oasis in the desert. I didn't get to talk about the DSP and how it disincentivizes completely any chance of ever getting a job and makes you beg for 2 years of being sick, and beg and beg and beg for 2 years before you get any hope of getting that payment. That is why so many disabled people are on Job Seeker. Every part of our welfare system is so ableist and so dehumanizing and treats people with disability as such a cost burden. We treat people with disability in this country not as human beings. So I just want to put that out there that we need to completely revolutionize our welfare system if we are ever to address the way we treat people with disability in this country. And they are the people who are most suffering from poverty in this country. But I'd put my hat on and then I'd go back to tax reform. And I would say what I say to every single campaign that I work on, whether it's the little campaign that called on school suspensions or the national campaign I ran with Pete on saving the NDIS, stories matter. People's stories is what matters. Percentages, numbers, how much it's going to save people, none of that matters. What matters is people's stories. It's how is this going to change someone's life? How is this going to help, the elderly person who wants to stay in their home for a little bit longer, or the disabled person who just can't afford their medication at the moment, or the mother that wants to go back to work but can't afford childcare. It's about saying this tax reform helps these people achieve that. But I think it's also about saying these are the stories of how our current tax system is hurting Australians, and who is it helping? Who's the current tax system helping? Who's currently benefiting? What are the stories around that? You know, do we want to keep seeing, you know, big businesses benefit while nurses can't afford to rent a unit near a public hospital? Like, is that the story we want to tell about Australia? Is that the Australian story we want? And so we tell a narrative, and, you know, I want to have a theory of change, and I want to develop that, and then I want to go away and find my stories, and I want to, you know, develop those, and I would have those people speak. I wouldn't have an economist speak. I wouldn't have probably anyone in this room speak. I would have those people speak. And, you know, because what are they going to throw at us? They're going to throw at us some like big business consultancy guy who's going to say, oh, you're going to have to pay a bit more tax. Well, that looks a little harsh next to the woman who can't go to work because childcare is too expensive. Like, that's going to look a little harsh next to the aged care lady who wants to stay in her home a little bit longer. Like, when you put the people up next to the problem, you humanize it. And Australians are good people. Australians really, really wanted Australians with disability to have lives that were fulfilling. They really wanted an NDIS that worked. They really still want that. You know, there are big businesses, big media conglomerates that at the moment that are really trying to push the idea that the NDIS is too expensive. It's too expensive. There are cost blowouts. The NDIS is just too expensive to run. And do you know what? Australians are not buying it, because they see in their everyday lives someone with a disability who is on the NDIS who, yeah, it might be a bit bureaucratic, it might be a bit like unfair sometimes, but again, at its foundation, it is changing people's lives, and they see that in their communities. So they're not buying that it's too expensive. And so, like, that's where the stories matter. And so any social campaign you run, that's what I would tell you.
So, some questions from the question, is ending poverty really as simple as well? Can you hear me now? Yes. Question for Kasy Chambers from Mentimeter. Is ending poverty really as simple as raising payments?
I think it's a good start. And, you know, we saw it in COVID. That was a fantastic natural experiment in so many ways, COVID. I hate to use the words COVID and fantastic in the same sentence, especially in a Victorian setting, because you guys did it tough. But it was an incredible showing of that. And as I said earlier, I say with some silliness, but we weren't swamped with people going to Bali. Well, they couldn't leave the country, but we weren't swamped with people going to Noosa or anywhere else either. People were genuinely, and we heard it from people we worked with, they were genuinely paying off debt so that they were able to enter different rental agreements. They were doing some training so that they were better able to get real jobs when the restrictions lifted. They were doing things that actually mattered. The one that, in terms of stories, and Elly, the passion from there, I don't know if you guys could feel it in the front row, but I could certainly feel it this close. The one that I really take on was a woman who was able to buy her 12-year-old daughter a small birthday present for the first time. Those are the kind of things that we hear, and that's why I call it future-facing, you know, those future-focused activities. But I think the important thing is it's about reframing some of these things. So we've got to stop seeing tax as a burden. That's why I tongue-in-cheek say, let's make it great again. You know, I think we should all be wearing these yellow T-shirts wherever we can wear them. it is, it might be a bit Pollyanna, but I think it is a privilege to pay tax. It enables me to have fresh water, to get on planes, to travel, to move around safely, to breathe fresh air, to travel on roads. That's before we even get to the kind of services that are dear to my heart. So I think we've got to do that. But I think the other thing we need to reframe is just remembering that this taxation that we're talking about, that fantastic history and kind of way through taxation that Miranda gave us earlier, none of that's laws of physics. None of it came down in a religious text from the beginning. You know, this is choice. These are absolute intellectual choices that human beings have put upon us and that we accept. So, you know, this taxation system, it's person-made and it should be for people. So I think we need to do some real reframing. But I do think that raising those working age payments is a good start.
Can I disagree? Can I just say I think that raising the rate of payments is not going to end poverty. I think we've heard here a perfect example of how ingrained gender inequality is in our welfare system. I know how ingrained ableism is in our welfare system. You know, if we don't fix those problems, if we don't fix the problems that mean that, you know, our welfare system is stopping people with disability from actually being able to work while accessing these payments, like, people with disability are still going to live in poverty. Because let me tell you, there is a disability tax. It costs a lot more to live with a disability than it costs to live without a disability. And so we live in poverty because also, like, there are a lot more expenses to living with disability. So, like, I don't think raising the cost of the payments is simply going to lift enough people out of poverty to fix poverty. I think we have to change things about the amount of care that women are doing unpaid. We have to fix the idea that people with disability, you know, can only work in sheltered workshops for $2.30 an hour, because yes, that still happens. And I don't see enough progressive people coming out and campaigning against that. So we need to fix lots of problems in this in order to lift people out of poverty, not just the payment rates.
Thank you, Elly. Thanks, Kasy. Jenny, last questions for you, and it also has come from Mentimeter. Australia has a proud tradition of downward envy. How do we break this cycle that undermines the welfare system's social licence?
I think that I would actually say it's the opposite, that there's a lot of disparaging of people that rely on our social security system. This idea that single mothers are, for example, are marginalised, you know, oh, they're the leaners, or, you know, oh, they can't keep a man. You know, these ideas, I mean, are you kidding? Who deserves your honour more than a woman that is running a house, working, raising children? Maybe she's you know, she's choosing between food on the table and turning on the heating, and she's waiting for child support, and maybe she's been waiting for years. The national child support debt in this country is $1.8 billion, and that doesn't represent the whole debt. So why are people who are in our social security system have to put in tax returns? A lot of people that have child support payments that they have to make don't put in tax returns. There are these ways in which you're policed. If you're in the social security system, you're belittled. You're, you know, told, you know, well, why don't you go and get a job? We heard the stats on really how many jobs there are out there. You know, and we have a system right now where if you are in the lower income, whether you're relying on our social security system or in paid work, you're not probably going to get public housing unless you have complex intersecting needs. You're not going to own a house. And increasingly, there aren't any houses that you can afford. So in actual fact, we've got a real mess, and it's going to get worse unless and look, tax reform is really important. We also need short and medium term solutions.
Thank you, Jenny. Thank you. Maybe just one brief comment on that last question, because there's some really powerful attitudes research that was mentioned at the front, but also ACOS has done some great attitudes research. I'm willing to believe actually there's a strong majority about investing more resources into public and community services and having a much bigger national agenda around growing equity, reducing poverty. But it's a concerted, comprehensive effort. And, Elly, you've given the comments about the insidious nature, the bastardry, as Ken Henry called it earlier today, that's in the system that impacts people's lives in an awful way that is nothing about them, but it's all about what the system has caused for them. One example that I'll leave you with, and this is something that I think many people wouldn't have even heard of or have experience with, it's called the Liquid Assets Waiting Period Threshold, right? The LAWP. So this was introduced in 1991. And it's essentially how much money, cash, you can have in the bank or not have in the bank to access social security payments. And it was introduced, if you're a single, it was about $5,500. And if you were in a couple, it was $11,000. Now, those rates have not been indexed or changed more or less since 1991. And in one quarter of last year, about 50% of people who were applying for payments were above those thresholds. And you can wait up to 13 weeks to access payments if you're above the thresholds, and that's on top of the waiting periods to access through Services Australia. And so because of that insidious part of the system where the median person on payments is a single parent with disability often, we are expecting people to drain their life savings and become impoverished in order to receive the safety net that was meant to support Australians in their emergencies. So there's a lot that has to be done, but it's the little parts of the system that can be quite insidious and ingrained as well. And with that, I'll hand back to Pete. And could you please give this wonderful panel a round of applause?